A string of bombings. Police say the attacks happened in several cities, including Baghdad.
Some of the inmates and the guards.
The national war on drugs has gone on literally for decades, with very few tangible benefits. At the same time, it has had devastating social, health, and economic impacts. And while our media will discuss tragic but isolated violence like spree killings ad nauseum, the everyday casualties of the drug war have been met with relative silence. Now, the connection between prohibition and violence is rather simple. In a black market, participants cannot settle commercial disputes using lawsuits or seek greater market share through advertising, so they're likely to use violence instead. The only way to establish and maintain their status and even survive in that type of system is violence. Prohibitions increase violence by creating black markets in which violence is used to solve disagreements. Now, virtually all countries have some type of drug prohibition policies. The difference is how and to what extent those policies are enforced. Now, many other countries, especially those with low violent crime rates, prefer medical or public health approaches to criminal sanctions for drug-related offenses. Now, criminal sanctions, like those that are favored in the US, prevent any sort of legal opportunities to resolve disputes, which only further promotes violence as a mechanism of dispute resolution. The black market for drugs creates a strong demand for guns for use in resolving disputes. In other words, the black market for drugs creates a black market for guns. And those guns, the ones bought and sold illegally and tied to the drug trade, are the guns most likely to be used in violent crime. And yet, we're constantly asked to set increasingly stringent restrictions on legal gun ownership. That is what we and our political leaders should find baffling. We know that we have created a market for violence. We know that market is tied to drug prohibition, and that many of those violent crimes are committed with illegally obtained guns. Now, historical data only further cements the link between drug prohibition and violence. In a recent study, Yale legal scholar Dan Cahan analyzed research on long-term homicide rates in the US. Now, he found that US homicide rates are directly tied to prohibition policies, first with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, and then later with the advent of the war on drugs. Homicide rates peaked in both 1920 and again in 1980. Cahan argues that the criminogenic properties of drug prohibition create both a demand for murder of one's competitors and a demand for guns to use for that purpose. It should be clear that there's a direct link between violence and the war on drugs. Now, how do we explain that? We have created a social system wherein survival and social status are tied to violent activity. Violence gets someone drugs. Violence settles a dispute. Violence gets someone power or elevates their status. Violence is the primary currency of the culture, a culture that we created that literally incentivizes violence. And our policies created that and continue to support that culture. Fighting a war on guns will not fix the violent consequences of our failed war on drugs. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have some policies that regulate the sale and use of recreational drugs. I am, however, saying that to continue to discuss violence while ignoring one of its key causes will only lead to more failed policy.